Chapter III. Guns That Fire Themselves. Many years ago a boy tried his hand at firing a United States Army service rifle. It was a heavy rifle of the Civil War period, and the lad did not know just how to hold it. He let the butt of the gun rest uncertainly against him, instead of pressing it firmly to his shoulder, and in consequence, when the gun went off, he received a powerful kick. That kick made a deep impression on the lad, not only on his flesh, but on his mind as well. It gave him a good conception of the power of a rifle cartridge. Years afterward, when he had moved to England, the memory of that kick was still with him. It was a useless prank of the gun, he thought, a waste of good energy. Why could not the energy be put to use? And so he set himself the task of harnessing the kick of the gun. A very busy program he worked out for that kick to perform. He planned to have the gun use up its exuberant energy in loading and firing itself. So he arranged the cartridges on a belt and fed the belt into the gun. When the gun was fired, the recoil would unlock the breech, take out the empty case of the cartridge just fired, select a fresh cartridge from the belt, and cock the main spring. Then the mechanism would return, throwing the empty cartridge case out of the gun, pushing the new cartridge into the barrel, closing the breech, and finally pulling the trigger. All this was to be done by the energy of a single kick, in about 1/10 of a second, and the gun would keep on repeating the operation as long as the supply of cartridges was fed to it. The new gun proved so successful that the inventor was knighted and became Sir Hiram Maxim. A doctor's 10-barreled gun. But Maxim's was by no means the first machine gun. During the Civil War a Chicago physician brought out a very ingenious 10-barreled gun, the barrels of which were fired one after the other by the turning of a hand crank. Although Dr. Gatling was a graduate of a medical school, he was far more fond of tinkering with machinery than of doling out pills. He invented a number of clever mechanisms, but the one that made him really famous was that machine gun. At first our government did not take the invention seriously. The gun was tried out in the war, but whenever it went into battle it was fired, not by soldiers, but by a representative of Dr. Gatling's company, who went into the army to demonstrate the worth of the invention. Not until long after was the Gatling gun officially adopted by our army. Then it was taken up by many of the European armies as well. Although many other machine guns were invented, the Gatling was easily the best and most serviceable until the Maxim invention made its appearance, and even then it held its own for many years. But eventually it had to succumb. The Maxim did not have to be cranked. It fired itself, which was a distinct advantage. And then, instead of being a bundle of guns all bound up into a single machine, Maxim's was a single-barreled gun, and hence was much lighter and could be handled much more easily. A gun as a gas engine. Another big advance was made by a third American, Mr. John M. Browning, who is responsible for the Colt gun. It was not a kick that set Browning to thinking. He looked upon a gun as an engine of the same order as an automobile engine, and really the resemblance is very close. The barrel of the gun is the cylinder of the engine, the bullet is the piston, and for fuel gunpowder is used in place of gasoline. As in the automobile engine, the charge is fired by a spark, but in the case of the gun the spark is produced by a blow of the trigger upon a bit of fulminate of mercury at the end of the cartridge. Explosion is the same thing as burning. The only way that the explosion of gunpowder differs from the burning of a stick of wood is that the latter is very slow, while the former goes like a flash. In both cases the fuel turns into great volumes of gas. In the case of the gun, the gas is formed almost instantly, and in such quantity that it has to drive the bullet out of the barrel to make room for itself. In the cartridge that our army uses, only about 1/10 of an ounce of smokeless powder is used, but this builds up so heavy a pressure of gas that the bullet is sent speeding out of the gun at a rate of half a mile a second. It travels so fast that it will plow through 4 feet of solid wood before coming to a stop. Now, it occurred to Browning that it wouldn't really be stealing to take a little of that gas power and use it to work the mechanism of his machine gun. It was ever so little he wanted, and the bullet would never miss it. The danger was not that he might take too much. His problem was to take any power at all without getting more than his mechanism could stand. What he did was to bore a hole through the side of the gun barrel. When the gun was fired, nothing happened until the bullet passed this hole. Then some of the gas that was pushing the bullet before it would blow out through the hole. But this would be a very small amount indeed, for the instant that the bullet passed out of the barrel, the gases would rush out after it, the pressure in the gun would drop, and the gas would stop blowing through the hole. With the bullet traveling at the rate of about half a mile in a second, imagine how short a space of time elapses after it passes the hole before it emerges from the muzzle, and what a small amount of gas can pass through the hole in that brief interval. The gas that Browning got in this way he led into a second cylinder, fitted with a piston. This piston was given a shove, and that gave a lever a kick which set going the mechanism that extracted the empty cartridge case, inserted a fresh cartridge, and fired it. Getting rid of heat. The resemblance of a machine gun to a gasoline engine can be demonstrated still further. One of the most important parts of an automobile engine is the cooling system. The gasoline burning in the cylinders would soon make them red hot were not some means provided to carry off the heat. The same is true of a machine gun. In fact, the heat is one of the biggest problems that has to be dealt with. In a gasoline engine, the heat is carried off in one of three ways. 1. By passing water around the cylinders. 2. By building flanges around the cylinders to carry the heat off into the air. And 3. By using a fan to blow cool air against the cylinders. All of these schemes are used in the machine gun. In Dr. Gatling's gun, the cooling problem was very simple. As there were 10 barrels, one barrel could be cooling while the rest were taking their turn in the firing. In other words, each barrel received only a tenth of the heat that the whole gun was producing, and yet Gatling found it advisable to surround the barrels for about half their length with a water jacket. In the Maxim gun, a water jacket is used that extends the full length of the barrel, and into this water jacket 7½ pints of water are poured. Yet in a minute and a half of steady firing at a moderate rate, or before 600 rounds are discharged, the water will be boiling. After that, with every 1,000 rounds of continuous fire, a pint and a half of water will be evaporated. Now the water and the water jacket add a great deal of weight to the gun, and this Browning decided to do away with in his machine gun. Instead of water he used air to carry off the heat. The more surface the air touches, the more heat will it carry away, and so the Colt gun was at first made with a very thick-walled barrel. But later the Colt was formed with flanges like the flanges on a motorcycle engine, so as to increase the surface of the barrel. Of course, air cooling is not so effective as water cooling, but it is claimed for this gun and for other machine guns of the same class that the barrel is sufficiently cooled for ordinary service. Although a machine gun may be capable of firing many hundred shots per minute, it is seldom that such a rate is kept up very long in battle. Usually only a few rounds are fired at a time, and then there is a pause, and there is plenty of time for the barrel to cool. Once in a while, however, the gun has to be fired continuously for several minutes, and then the barrel grows exceedingly hot. Effect of overheating. But what if the gun barrel does become hot? The real trouble is not that the cartridges will explode prematurely, but that the barrel will expand as it grows hot, so that the bullet will fit too loosely in the bore. Inside the barrel the bore is rifled, that is, there are spiral grooves in it which give a twist to the bullet as it passes through, setting it spinning like a top. The spin of the bullet keeps its nose pointing forward. If it were not for the rifling, the bullet would tumble over and over every which way, and it could not go very far through the air, to say nothing of penetrating steel armor. To gain the spinning motion, the bullet must fit into the barrel snugly enough to squeeze into the spiral grooves. Now, there is another American machine gun known as the Hotchkiss, which was used to a considerable extent by the French army. It is a gas-operated gun, somewhat like the Colt, and it is air-cooled. It was found in tests of the Hotchkiss gun that in from 3 to 4 minutes of firing, the barrel was expanded so much that the shots began to be a little uncertain. In 7 minutes of continuous firing, the barrel had grown so large that the rifling failed to grip the bullet at all. The gun was no better than an old-fashioned smoothbore. The bullets would not travel more than 300 yards. It is because of this danger of overheating that the Colt and the Hotchkiss guns are always furnished with a spare barrel. As soon as a barrel gets hot it is uncoupled and the spare one is inserted in its place. Our men are trained to change the barrel of a Colt in the dark in a quarter of a minute. But a gun that has to have a spare barrel and that has to have its barrel changed in the midst of a hot engagement is not an ideal weapon by any means. And this brings us to still another invention, that too by an American. Colonel I.N. Lewis of the United States Army conceived of a machine gun that would be cooled not by still air but by air in motion. This would do away with all the bother of water jackets. It would keep the gun light so that it could be operated by one man, and yet it would not have to be supplied with a spare barrel. Like the Colt and the Hotchkiss, the Lewis gun takes its power from the gas that comes through a small port in the barrel near the muzzle. In the plate facing page 44, the port may be seen leading into a cylinder that lies under the barrel. It takes about 1/10,000th part of a second for a bullet to pass out of the barrel after clearing the port, but in that brief interval there is a puff of gas in the cylinder which drives back a piston. This piston has teeth on it which engages a small gear connected with a mainspring. When the piston moves back, it winds the spring, and it is this spring that operates the mechanism of the gun. The cartridges, instead of being taken from a belt or a clip, are taken from a magazine that is round and flat. There are 47 cartridges in the magazine, and they are arranged like the spokes of a wheel, but in 2 layers. As soon as 47 rounds have been fired, the shooting must stop while a new magazine is inserted, but to insert it takes only a couple of seconds. Using the bullet to fan the gun. The most ingenious part of the Lewis gun is the cooling system. On the barrel of the gun are 16 flanges or fins. These, instead of running around the gun, run lengthways of the barrel. They are very light fins, being made of aluminum, and are surrounded by a casing of the same metal. The casing is open at each end so that the air can flow through it, but it extends beyond the muzzle of the barrel, and there it is narrowed down. At the end of the barrel there is a mouthpiece so shaped that the bullet, as it flies through, sucks a lot of air in its wake, making a strong current flow through the 16 channels formed between the fins inside the casing. This air flows at the rate of about 70 miles per hour, which is enough to carry off all the heat that is generated by the firing of the cartridges. The gun may be regulated to fire between 350 and 750 rounds per minute, and its total weight is only 25½ pounds. America can justly claim the honor of inventing and developing the machine gun, although Hiram Maxim did give up his American citizenship and become a British subject. By the way, he is not to be confused with his younger brother, Hudson Maxim, the inventor of high explosives, who has always been an American to the core. Of course, we must not get the impression that only Americans have invented machine guns. There have been inventors of such weapons in various countries of Europe and even in Japan. Our own army for a while used a gun known as the Benet Mercier, which is something like the Hotchkiss. This was invented by L.V. Benet, an American, and H.A. Mercier, a Frenchman, both living in Saint Denis, France. The Browning machine gun. When we entered the war, it was expected that we would immediately equip our forces with the Lewis gun, because the British and the Belgians had found it an excellent weapon, and also because it was invented by an American officer who very patriotically offered it to our government without charging patent royalties. But the Army officials would not accept it, although many Lewis guns were bought by the Navy. This raised a storm of protest throughout the country, until finally it was learned that there was another gun for which the Army was waiting, which it was said would be the very best yet. The public was skeptical, and finally a test was arranged in Washington at which the worth of the new gun was demonstrated. It was a new Browning model. Or rather, there were two distinct models. One of them, known as the heavy model, weighed only 34½ pounds, this with its water jacket filled, for it was a water-cooled gun. Without its charge of water, the machine weighed but 22½ pounds, and could be rated as a very light machine gun. However, it was classed as a heavy gun, and was operated from a tripod. The new machine used recoil to operate its mechanism. The construction was simple, there were few parts, and the gun could very quickly be taken apart in case of breakage or disarrangement of the mechanism. But the greatest care was exercised to prevent jamming of cartridges, which was one of the principal defects in the other types of machine guns. In the test this new weapon fired 20,000 rounds at the rate of 600 per minute, with interruptions of only 4½ seconds, due partly to defective cartridges. There was no doubt that the new Browning was a remarkable weapon. But if that could be said of the heavy gun, the light gun was a marvel. It weighed only 15 pounds and was light enough to be fired from the shoulder or from the hip, while the operator was walking or running. In fact, it was really a machine rifle. The regular .30 caliber service cartridges were used, and these were stored in a clip holding 20 cartridges. The cartridges could be fired one at a time, or the entire clip could be fired in 2½ seconds. It took but a second to drop an empty clip out of the gun and replace it with a fresh one. The rifle was gas operated and air cooled, but no special cooling device was supplied because it would seldom be necessary to fire a shoulder rifle fast enough and long enough for the barrel to become overheated. After the Browning machine rifle was demonstrated, it was realized that the Army had been perfectly justified in waiting for the new weapon. Like the heavy Browning, the new rifle was a very simple mechanism, with few parts which needed no special tools to take them apart or reassemble them. A single small wrench served this purpose. Both the heavy and the light gun were proof against mud, sand, and dust in the battlefield. But best of all, a man did not have to have highly specialized training before he could use the Browning rifle. It did not require a crew to operate one of these guns. Each soldier could have his own machine gun and carry it in a charge as he would a rifle. The advantage of the machine rifle was that the operator could fire as he ran, watching where the bullets struck the ground by noting the dust they kicked up, and in that way correcting his aim until he was on the target. Very accurate shooting was thus made possible, and the machine rifle proved invaluable in the closing months of the war. Browning is unquestionably the foremost inventor of firearms in the world. He was born of Mormon parents in Ogden, Utah, in 1854, and his father had a gun shop. As a boy, Browning became familiar with the use of firearms, and when he was but 14 years of age he invented an improved breech mechanism, which was later used in the Winchester repeater. Curiously enough, it was a Browning pistol that was used by the assassin at Sarajevo who killed the Archduke of Austria and precipitated the great European War, and it was with the Browning machine gun and rifle that our boys swept the Germans back through the Argonne Forest and helped to bring the war to a successful end. The machine gun in service. Although the machine gun has been used ever since the Civil War, it was not a vital factor in warfare until the recent great conflict. Army officials were very slow to take it up because they did not understand it. They used to think of it as an inferior piece of light artillery instead of a superior rifle. The Gatling was so heavy that it had to be mounted on wheels, and naturally it was thought of as a cannon. In the Franco-Prussian War the French had a machine gun by which they set great store. It was called a mitrailleuse, or a gun for firing grape shot. It was something like the Gatling. The French counted on this machine to surprise and overwhelm the Germans, but they made the mistake of considering it a piece of artillery, and fired it from long range, so that it did not have a chance to show its worth. Only on one or two occasions was it used at close range, and then it did frightful execution. However, it was a very unsatisfactory machine and kept getting out of order. It earned the contempt of the Germans, and later, when the Maxim gun was offered to the German army, they would have none of it. They did not want to bother with a toy cannon. It really was not until the war between Russia and Japan that military men began to realize the value of the machine gun. As the war went on, both the Russians and the Japanese bought up all the machine guns they could secure. They learned what could be done with the aid of barbed wire to retard the enemy, while the machine gun mowed them down as they were trying to get through. A man with a machine gun is worth 100 men with rifles. Such is the military estimate of the weapon. The gun fires so fast that after hitting a man it will hit him again 10 times while he is falling to the ground. And so it does not pay to fire the gun continuously in one direction unless there is a dense mass of troops charging upon it. Usually the machine gun is swept from side to side so as to cover as wide a range as possible. It is played upon the enemy as you would play the hose upon the lawn, scattering a shower of lead among the advancing hosts. Machine gun forts. It used to be thought that the Belgian forts of armored steel and concrete, almost completely buried in the ground, would hold out against any artillery. But when the Germans brought up their great howitzers and hurled undreamed of quantities of high explosives on these forts, they broke and crumbled to pieces. Then it was predicted that the day of the fort was over. But the machine gun developed a new type of warfare. Instead of great forts, mounting huge guns, little machine gun forts were built, and they were far more troublesome than the big fellows. To the Germans belongs the credit for the new type of fort, which consisted of a small concrete structure hidden from view as far as possible, but commanding some important part of the front. Pill-boxes, the British call them, because the first ones they ran across were round in shape and something like a pill-box in appearance. These pill-boxes were just large enough to house a few men and a couple of machine guns. Concealment was of the utmost importance. Safety depended upon it. Airplanes were particularly feared because a machine gun emplacement was recognized to be so important that a whole battery of artillery would be turned upon a suspected pill-box. Some of the German machine gun forts were very elaborate, consisting of spacious underground chambers where a large garrison of gunners could live. These forts were known as Mebus, a word made from the initials of Maschinengewehr Eisenbetonunterstand, meaning a machine gun iron-bedded foundation. It was the machine gun that was responsible for the enormous expenditure of ammunition in the war. Before a body of troops dared to make a charge, the ground had to be thoroughly searched by the big guns for any machine gun nests. Unless these were found and destroyed by shell fire, the only way that remained to get the best of them was to crush them down with tanks. It was really the machine gun that drove the armies into trenches and under the ground. But a machine gun did not have to be housed in a fort, particularly a light gun of the Lewis type. To be sure, the Lewis gun is a little heavy to be used as a rifle, but it could easily be managed with a rest for the muzzle in the crotch of a tree, and a strong man could actually fire the piece from the shoulder. The light machine gun could go right along with a charging body of troops and do very efficient service, particularly in fighting in a town or village, but it had to be kept moving or it would be a target for the artillery. In a certain village fight, a machine gunner kept changing his position. He would fire for a few minutes from one building and then shift over to some other. He did this no less than 6 times, never staying more than 5 minutes at a time in the same spot. But each one of the houses was shelled within 15 minutes of the time he opened fire from it, which shows the importance that the Germans attached to machine gun fire. Chapter IV. Guns and Superguns. When the news came that big shells were dropping into Paris from a gun which must be at least 70 miles away, the world at first refused to believe. Then it imagined that some brand new form of gun or shell or powder had been invented by the Germans. However, while the public marveled, ordnance experts were interested but not astonished. They knew that it was perfectly feasible to build a gun that would hurl a shell 50 or 75 or even 100 miles without involving anything new in the science of gunnery. Shooting around the edge of the earth. But if such ranges were known to be possible, why was no such long-distance gun built before? Simply because none but the Germans would ever think of shooting around the edge of the earth at a target so far away that it would have to be as big as a whole city to be hit at all. At a distance of 70 miles, the curve of the earth is considerable. Paris is far below the horizon of a man standing at Saint-Gobain, where the big German gun was located, and if a hole were bored from Saint-Gobain straight to Paris, so that you could see the city from the gun, it would pass, midway of its course, 3,750 feet below the surface of the earth, with the target so far off it was impossible to aim at any particular fort, ammunition depot, or other point of military importance. There is always some uncertainty as to just where a shell will fall, due to slight differences in quality and quantity of the powder used, in the density of the air, the direction of the wind, etc. This variation is bad enough when a shell is to be fired 10 miles, but when the missile has to travel 70 miles, it is out of the question to try to hit a target that is not miles in extent. 20 years before the war our Ordnance Department had designed a 50-mile gun, but it was not built because we could see no possible use for it. Our guns were built for fighting naval battles or for the defense of our coast from naval attacks, and there is certainly no use in firing at a ship that is so far below the horizon that we cannot even see the tips of its masts, and so our big guns, though they were capable of firing a shell 27 miles if aimed high enough, were usually mounted in carriages that would not let them shoot more than 12 or 15 miles. The distance to which a shell can be hurled depends to a large extent upon the angle of the gun. If the gun is tilted up to an angle of 15 degrees, the shell will go only about half as far as if it were tilted up to 43½ degrees, which is the angle that will carry a shell to its greatest distance. If the long-range German gun was fired at that angle, the shell must have risen to a height of about 24 miles. Beyond the earth's atmosphere. Most of the air that surrounds our globe lies within 4 miles of the surface. Few aeroplanes can rise to a greater height than this, because the air is so thin that it gives no support to the wings of the machine. The greatest height to which a man has ever ascended is 7 miles. A balloon once carried 2 men to such a height. One of them lost consciousness, and the other, who was nearly paralyzed, succeeded in pulling the safety valve rope with his teeth. That brought the balloon down, and their instruments showed that they had gone up 36,000 feet. What the ocean of air contains above that elevation we do not know, but judging by the way the atmosphere thins out as we rise from the surface of the earth, we reckon that 9/10 of the air lies within 10 miles of the surface of the earth. At 24 miles, or the top of the curve described by the shell of the German long-range guns, there must be an almost complete vacuum. If only we could accompany a shell on its course, we should find a strange condition of affairs. The higher we rose, the darker would the heavens become until the sun would shine like a fiery ball in a black sky. All around, the stars would twinkle, and below would be the glare of light reflected from the earth's surface and its atmosphere, while the cold would be far more intense than anything suffered on earth. Up at that height there would be nothing to indicate that the shell was moving, no rush of air against the ears. We should seem detached from earth and out in the endless reaches of space. It seems absurd to think that a shell weighing close to 1/4 of a ton could be retarded appreciably by mere air, but when we realize that the shell left the gun at the rate of over half a mile a second, traveling about 30 times faster than an express train, we know that the air pressure mounts up to a respectable figure. The pressure is the same whether a shell is moving through the air or the air is moving against the shell. When the wind blows at the rate of 100 to 120 miles per hour, it is strong enough to lift houses off their foundations, to wrench trees out of the ground, to pick up cattle and carry them sailing through the air. Imagine what it would do if its velocity were increased to 1,800 miles per hour. That is what the shell of a big gun has to contend with. As most of the air lies near the earth, the shell of long-range guns meet with less and less resistance the higher they rise, until they get up into such thin air that there is virtually no obstruction. The main trouble is to pierce the blanket of heavy air that lies near the earth. Ways of increasing the range. The big 16-inch guns that protect our coasts fire a shell that weighs 2,400 pounds. 900 pounds of smokeless powder is used to propel the shell, which leaves the muzzle of the gun with a speed of 2,600 feet per second. Now, the larger the diameter of the shell, the greater will be its speed at the muzzle of the gun, because there will be greater surface for the powder gases to press against. On the other hand, the larger the shell, the more will it be retarded by the air, because there will be a larger surface for the air to press against. It has been proposed by some ordnance experts that a shell might be provided with a disc at each end, which would make it fit a gun of larger caliber. A 10-inch shell, for instance, could then be fired from a 16-inch gun. Being lighter than the 16-inch shell, it would leave the muzzle of the gun at a higher speed. The discs could be so arranged that as soon as the shell left the gun they would be thrown off, and then the 10-inch shell, although starting with a higher velocity than a 16-inch shell, would offer less resistance to the air. In that way it could be made to cover a much greater range. By the way, the shell of the German long-range gun was of but 8.5-inch caliber. Another way of increasing the range is to lengthen the gun. Right here we must become acquainted with the word caliber. Caliber means the diameter of the shell. A 16-inch gun, for instance, fires a shell of 16-inch caliber. But when we read that the gun is a 40 or 50 caliber gun, it means that the length of the gun is 40 or 50 times the diameter of the shell. Our biggest coast defense guns are 50 caliber, 16-inch guns, which means that they are 50 times 16 inches long, or 66 2/3 feet in length. When a gun is so long as that, care has to be taken to prevent it from sagging at the muzzle of its own weight. These guns actually do sag a little, and when the shell is fired through the long barrel, it straightens up the gun, making the muzzle whip upward, just as a drooping garden hose does when the water shoots through it. Now, the longer the caliber length of a gun, the farther it will send a shell, because the powder gases will have a longer time to push the shell. But we cannot lengthen our big guns much more without using some special support for the muzzle end of the gun to keep it from whipping too much. It is likely that the long-range German gun was provided with a substantial support at the muzzle to keep it from sagging. Every once in a while a man comes forth with a new idea for increasing the range. One plan is to increase the powder pressure. We have powders that will produce far more pressure than an ordinary gun can stand. But we have to use powders that will burn comparatively slowly. We do not want too sudden a shock to start with, but we wish the powder to give off an enormous quantity of gas, which will keep on pushing and speeding up the shell until the latter emerges from the muzzle. The 50-mile gun that was proposed 20 years ago was designed to stand a much higher pressure than is commonly used, and it would have fired a 10-inch shell weighing 600 pounds with a velocity of 4,000 feet per second at the muzzle. The Allies built no super guns, because they knew that they could drop a far greater quantity of explosives with much greater accuracy from airplanes, and at a much lower cost. The German gun at St. Gobain was spectacular, and it did some damage, but it had no military value, and it did not intimidate the French as the Germans had hoped it would. A gun with a range of 120 miles. But although we built no such gun, after the Germans began shelling Paris, our Ordnance Department designed a gun that would fire a shell to a distance of over 120 miles. There was no intention of constructing the gun, but the design was worked out just as if it were actually to be built. It was to fire a shell of 10-inch caliber weighing 400 pounds. Now, an Ellswick standard 10-inch gun is 42 feet long, and its shell weighs 500 pounds. 200 pounds of powder are used to propel the shell, which leaves the muzzle with a velocity of 3,000 feet per second. If the gun is elevated to the proper angle, it will send the shell 25 miles, and it will take the shell a minute and 37 seconds to cover that distance. But the long-range gun our ordnance experts designed would have to be charged with 1,440 pounds of powder, and the shell would leave the muzzle of the gun with a velocity of 8,500 feet per second. It would be in the air 4 minutes and 9 seconds, and would travel 121.3 miles. Were the gun fired from the Aberdeen Proving Grounds near Baltimore, Maryland, its shell would travel across 3 states and fall into New York Bay at Perth Amboy. At the top of its trajectory it would rise 46 miles above the earth. But the most astonishing part of the design was the length of the gun, which worked out to 225 feet. An enormous powder chamber would have to be used, so that the powder gases would keep speeding up the shell until it reached the required velocity at the muzzle. The weight of the barrel alone was estimated at 325 tons. It would have to be built up in 4 sections, screwed together, and because of its great length and weight it would have to be supported on a steel truss. The gun would be mounted like a roller lift bridge, with a heavy counterweight at its lower end so that it could be elevated or depressed at will, and a powerful hydraulic jack would be required to raise it. The recoil of a big gun is always a most important matter. Unless a gun can recoil, it will be smashed by the shock of the powder explosion. Usually heavy springs are used to take up the shock, or cylinders filled with oil in which pistons slide. The pistons have small holes in them through which the oil is forced as the piston moves, and this retards the gun in its recoil. But this super gun was designed to be mounted on a carriage running on a set of tracks laid in a long concrete pit. On the recoil, the gun would run back along the tracks, and its motion would be retarded by friction blocks between the carriage and the tracks, and also by a steel cable attached to the forward end of the carriage and running over a pulley in the front wall of the pit to a friction drum. The engraving facing page 68 gives some idea of the enormous size of the gun. Note the man at the breech of the gun. The hydraulic jack is collapsible so that the gun may be brought to the horizontal position for loading, as shown by the dotted lines. The cost of building this gun is estimated at $2.5 million, and its 400-pound shell would land only about 60 pounds of high explosive on the target. A bombing plane costing but $30,000 could land 25 times as big a charge of high explosives with far greater accuracy. Aside from this, the gun lining would soon wear out because of the tremendous erosion of the powder gases. The 3-second life of a gun. Powder gases are very hot indeed, hot enough to melt steel. The greater the pressure in the gun, the hotter they are. It is only because they pass through the gun so quickly that they do not melt it. As a matter of fact, they do wear it out rapidly because of their heat and velocity. They say that the life of a big gun is only 3 seconds. Of course, a shell passes through the gun in a very minute part of a second, but if we add up these tiny periods until we have a total of 3 seconds, during which the gun may have fired 200 rounds, we shall find that the lining of the barrel is so badly eroded that the gun is unfit for accurate shooting, and it must go back to the shops for a new inner tube. Elastic guns. We had better go back with it and learn something about the manufacture of a big gun. Guns used to be cast as a solid chunk of metal. Now they are built up in layers. To understand why this is necessary, we must realize that steel is not a dead mass, but is highly elastic, far more elastic than rubber, although of course it does not stretch nor compress so far. When a charge of powder is exploded in the barrel of a gun, it expands in all directions. Of course, the projectile yields to the pressure of the powder gases and is sent kiting out of the muzzle of the gun. But for an instant before the shell starts to move, an enormous force is exerted against the walls of the bore of the gun, and because steel is elastic, the barrel is expanded by this pressure, and the bore is actually made larger for a moment, only to spring back in the next instant. You can picture this action if you imagine a gun made of rubber. As soon as the powder was fired, the rubber gun would bulge out around the powder chamber, only to collapse to its normal size when the pressure was relieved by the discharge of the bullet. Now, every elastic body has what is called its elastic limit. If you take a coil spring, you can pull it out or you can compress it, and it will always return to its original shape, unless you pull it out or compress it beyond a certain point. That point is its elastic limit. The same is true of a piece of steel. If you stretch it beyond a certain point, it will not return to its original shape. When the charge of powder in a cannon exceeds a certain amount, it stretches the steel beyond its elastic limit, so that the bore becomes permanently larger. Making the walls of the gun heavier would not prevent this, because steel is so elastic that the inside of the walls expands beyond its elastic limit before the outside is affected at all. Years ago, an American inventor named Treadwell worked out a scheme for allowing the bore to expand more without exceeding its elastic limit. He built up his gun in layers, and shrunk the outer layers upon the inner layers, just as a blacksmith shrinks a tire on a wheel, so that the inner tube of the gun would be squeezed or compressed. When the powder was fired, this inner layer could expand farther without danger, because it was compressed to start with. The built-up gun was also independently invented by a British inventor. All modern big guns are built up. How big guns are made. The inside tube, known as the lining, is cast roughly to shape, then it is bored out, after which it is forged by the blows of a powerful steam hammer. Of course, while under the hammer, the tube is mounted on a mandrel or bar that just fits the bore. The metal is then softened in an annealing furnace, after which it is turned down to the proper diameter and rebored to the exact caliber. The diameter of the linings is made 3/10,000ths of an inch larger than the inside of the hoop or sleeve that fits over it. This sleeve, which is formed in the same way, is heated up to 800 degrees, or until its inside diameter is 0.8 of an inch larger than the outside diameter of the lining. The lining is stood up on end and the sleeve is fitted over it. Then it is cooled by means of water, so that it grips the lining and compresses it. In this way layer after layer is added until the gun is built up to its proper size. Instead of having a lining that is compressed by means of sleeves or jackets, many big guns are wound with wire which is pulled so tight as to compress the lining. The gun tube is placed in a lathe and is turned so as to wind up the wire upon it. A heavy brake on the wire keeps it drawn very tight. This wire also is put on in layers so that each layer can expand considerably without exceeding its elastic limit. Our big 16-inch coast defense guns are wound with wire that is 1/10 of an inch square. The length of wire on one gun is sufficient to reach all the way from New York to Boston with 50 or 60 miles of wire left over. Guns that play hide and seek. A very ingenious invention is the disappearing mount, which is used on our coast fortifications. By means of this a gun is hidden beyond its breastworks, so that it is absolutely invisible to the enemy. In this sheltered position it is loaded and aimed. It is not necessary to sight the gun on the target as you would sight a rifle. The aiming is done mathematically. Off at some convenient observation post, an observer gets the range of the target and telephones this range to the plotting room, where a rapid calculation is made as to how much the gun should be elevated and swung to the right or the left. This calculation is then sent on to the gunners, who adjust the gun accordingly. When all is ready, the gun is raised by hydraulic pressure, and just as it rises above the parapet it is automatically fired. The recoil throws the gun back to its crouching position behind the breastworks. All that the enemy sees, if anything, is the flash of the discharge. Now that airplanes have been invented, the disappearing mount has lost much of its usefulness. Big guns have to be hidden from above. They are usually located behind a hill 5 or 6 miles back of the trenches, where the enemy cannot see them from the ground, and they are carefully hidden under trees or a canopy of foliage, or are disguised with paint. The huge guns recently built to defend our coasts are intended to fire a shell that will pierce the heavy armor of a modern dreadnought. The shell is arranged to explode after it has penetrated the armor, and the penetrating power is a very important matter. About 30 years ago the British built 3 battleships, each fitted with 2 guns of 16¼ inch caliber and a 30 caliber length. In order to test the penetrating power of this gun, a target was built consisting first of 20 inches of steel armor and 8 inches of wrought iron. This was backed by 20 feet of oak, 5 feet of granite, 11 feet of concrete, and 6 feet of brick. When the shell struck this target, it passed through the steel, the iron, the oak, the granite, and the concrete, and did not stop until it had penetrated 3 feet of the brick. We have not subjected our 16-inch gun to such a test, but we know that it would go through 2 such targets and still have plenty of energy left. Incidentally, it cost us $1,680 each time the big gun is fired. The famous 42-centimeter gun. One of the early surprises of the war was the huge gun used by the Germans to destroy the powerful Belgian forts. Properly speaking, this was not a gun but a howitzer, and right here we must learn the difference between mortars, howitzers, and guns. What we usually mean by gun is a piece of long caliber which is designed to hurl its shell with a flat trajectory. But long ago it was found advantageous to throw a projectile not at but upon a fortification, and for this purpose short pieces of large bore were built. This would fire at a high angle so that the projectile would fall almost vertically on the target. As we have said, the bore of a gun is rifled, that is, it is provided with spiral grooves that will set the shell spinning, so as to keep its nose pointing in the direction of its flight. Mortars, on the other hand, were originally intended for short-range firing, and their bore was not rifled. In recent years, however, mortars have been made longer and with rifled bores, so as to increase their range, and such long mortars are called howitzers. The German 42 centimeter howitzer fired a shell that was 2,108 pounds in weight and was about 1½ yards long. The diameter of the shell was 42 centimeters, which is about 16½ inches. It carried an enormous amount of high explosive, which was designed to go off after the shell had penetrated its target. The marvel of this howitzer was not that it could fire so big a shell, but that so large a piece of artillery could be transported over the high roads and be set for use in battle. But although the 42 centimeter gun was widely advertised, the real work of smashing the Belgian forts was done by the Austrian Skoda howitzers, which fired a shell of 30.5 centimeter (12-inch) caliber, and not by the 42 centimeter gun. The Skoda howitzer could be taken apart and transported by 3 motor cars of 100 horsepower each. The cars traveled at a rate of about 12 miles per hour. It is claimed the gun could be put together in 24 minutes and would fire at the rate of 1 shot per minute. Field guns. So far we have talked only of the big guns, but in a modern battle the field gun plays a very important part. This fires a shell that weighs between 14 and 18 pounds and is about 3 inches in diameter. The shell and the powder that fires it are contained in a cartridge that is just like the cartridge of a shoulder rifle. These field pieces are built to be fired rapidly. The French 75 millimeter gun, which is considered one of the best, will fire at the rate of 20 shots per minute, and its effective range is considerably over 3 miles. The French supplied us with all 75 millimeter guns we needed in the war, while we concentrated our efforts on the manufacture of ammunition. Guns that fire guns. During the War of the Revolution, cannon were fired at short range, and it was the custom to load them with grape shot, or small iron balls, when firing against a charging enemy, because the grape would scatter like the shot of a shotgun and tear a bigger gap in the ranks of the enemy than would a single solid cannon ball. In modern warfare guns are fired from a greater distance, so that there will be little danger of their capture. It is impossible for them to fire grape because the ranges are far too great. Besides, it would be impossible to aim a charge of grape shot over any considerable distance, because the shot would start spreading as soon as they left the muzzle of the gun, and would scatter too far and wide to be of much service. But this difficulty has been overcome by the making of a shell which is really a gun in itself. Within this shell is the grape shot, which consists of 250 half-inch balls of lead. The shell is fired over the lines of the enemy, and just at the right moment it explodes and scatters a hail of leaden balls over a fairly wide area. It is not a simple matter to time a shrapnel shell so that it will explode at just the right moment. Spring-driven clockwork has been tried, which would explode a cap after the lapse of a certain amount of time, but this way of timing shells has not proved satisfactory. Nowadays a train of gunpowder is used. When the shell is fired, the shock makes a cap (see drawing facing page 77) strike a pin, which ignites the train of powder. The head of the shell is made of 2 parts, in each of which there is a powder fuse. There is a vent or short cut leading from one fuse to the other, and by the turning of one part of the fuse head with respect to the other, this short cut is made to carry the train of fire from the upper to the lower fuse sooner or later, according to the adjustment. The fire burns along one powder train and then jumps through the short cut to the other, or movable train, as it is called, until it finally reaches the main charge in the shell. The movable part of the fuse head is graduated, so that the fuse may be set to explode the shell at any desired distance. In the fuse head there is also a detonating pin, which will strike the primer and explode the shell when the latter strikes the ground, if the time fuse has failed to act. When attacking airplanes, it is important to be able to follow the flight of the shell, so some shrapnel shell are provided with a smoke producing mixture which is set on fire when the shell is discharged so as to produce a trail of smoke. In meeting the attack of any enemy at night, searchlight shell are sometimes used. On exploding, they discharge a number of candles, each provided with a tiny parachute that lets the candle drop slowly to the ground. Their brilliant light lasts 15 or 20 minutes. Obviously, ordinary searchlights could not be used on the battlefield because the lamp would at once be a target for enemy batteries, but with searchlight shell the gun that fires them can remain hidden and one's own lines be shrouded in darkness while the enemy lines are brilliantly illuminated. Chapter 5